vis-a-vis the foreign exchange market, expectations do play a role because, again, given that the traders have a sense about how much foreign exchange is available in the system, they have an idea of how easy it is going for me to access the foreign exchange when I actually need it. What does it mean? First of all, if you do get it, you hold on. If you do get it, you don't surrender it at the official rate. And that's what drives all the smuggling and the trade misinvoicing will get started, so that exporters, when they do sell their products, they don't actually declare their earnings to the central bank because they know. And in November, we had a very interesting conference on Burundi, and we heard some from first hand from commercial bankers who recount the complaints from their customers. They say, you want me to transfer my earnings to my account here when I sell my products in Belgium, in France, and so on. The problem is that if next week I come to ask you for dollars to go buy my equipment, you won't give it to me. You will tell me that I'm not a priority because the government has priority sectors, goods like medicine, oil, and so on. That creates incentives for getting the system. That if you have the dollars, you don't surrender them. If you ever find a window to the central bank, you go to ask more than you need, so that you can hold it for the next one. Which means that really the official exchange rate is almost limitless. Carol is next. Carol, yeah.
Carol, you're muted. Okay.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the to raise agricultural productivity. You mentioned that agribusiness. What I'm wondering is, would there be a need for some kind of parallel policies with regard to income distribution? I'm thinking about the earlier experiences of green revolution technology that did raise productivity, but also worsened income distribution, especially in rural areas.
That's a super good question. Yeah, so the agricultural industrialization policy program includes lots of efforts to raise productivity through improved seeds, distribution of fertilizers, building agricultural infrastructure for irrigation and roads and all that. So I think they have the whole package correctly. But you raise a very interesting question about accompanying measures to limit or to reduce potential negative distributional effects that the gains to progress in agriculture may occur to people at the top of the income distribution areas. That question is especially pertinent in the case of Ethiopia because of the particular nature of the land ownership structure, or the land ownership law. In Ethiopia, land belongs to the government, and people use it because they are using it. If you're not using it, you don't have it. And if you want to have a claim on land, you can lease the land. The government will lease it to you for 99 years if you're doing commercial agriculture and so on. But that's an issue that people have mentioned over time, that lack of clear ownership of land is a disincentive for investment in agricultural productivity. If I'm not sure how long I'm going to stay on the land, why should I invest my money in improving the land? But also, it means that the people, if you have capital, you can in fact lease land, and you can grow, create a modern farm. But if you don't have much money, then it's subsistence agriculture. So I think the point about how you get, first of all, get agricultural productivity rising, but also how you get it benefiting the productivity of the people, brings in a discussion of land ownership and the entitlement to land rights, which is a very sensitive issue in Ethiopia.
Okay, anybody?
Am I up now?
Yes? of course you're allowed.
Just, I'm just trying to understand the relationship between the structure of domestic inflation, imported inflation, the foreign exchange reserve and the exchange rate. Because if we say that a supply side shock is what is pushing up domestic prices, then if I'm in a position to import from abroad, that's a way of changing domestic supply without domestic production and holding the price level. So normally it would be a situation in which you import, let's say, food grain, when you have a supply shock, in order to hold the price level. So it is true that you can have differential prices domestically and internationally, but as far as the change is concerned, once I can allow the flow of stocks from abroad. So is the argument that because you have a foreign exchange shortage, you're not in a position to be able to import. That results, or you tend to import and you run out of reserves, and that actually results in a depreciation. And the depreciation renders the imported stock more expensive, so that you can simultaneously have a domestic inflation factor and imported inflation factor for food price inflation. Because otherwise, imports should actually control domestic price inflation in other circumstances. And I just one small, to go back to that Bob's point about energy subsidies and food, if the government, let us say, is subsidizing energy and is borrowing to subsidize energy, if it had actually, let's say, taxed to subsidize energy, it would be one thing, but if it borrows to subsidize energy, that is essentially saying that it's pushing up food prices, assuming that there are supply constraints, so when it spends, food prices go up. That surplus accrues first to the private sector, and then the private sector lends it to the state. So even if we think that there's a positive benefit in terms of the energy subsidy, there's a negative forced saving being pulled out because you're allowing the price level to go up, the surplus accruing to the private sector, and the private sector then lending to the state to finance its energy subsidy.
How do prices go up if you subsidize oil prices?
No, food prices go up.
Oh, food prices, yeah.
So you're pushing up food prices because you're in the context of a supply side constraint, you're borrowing and spending. But if you tax, the money comes directly to the state. Here what's happening is it first accrues to the private sector, the surplus, because food prices are going up, and the private sector then lends to the state. I mean that's what seems to be working out. So I don't know, the question is really, is it necessary that that's a good thing? I mean, even if energy subsidies per se are a good thing.
It's how you finance them.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question, I think there are a number of things to consider. So you might consider situations where bad rain, droughts, cereal production is lower than needed. You say one way to address that is to rely on imported cereal, okay? And if you do that, then there should not be an increase in prices, okay? True, it wouldn't matter where you get the grain from. If you had it in your storage and the grain prices, the grain harvest decline, and you can draw from your grain storage and put it on the market, you would imagine that the prices are going to stabilize. This is assuming that the price you put on market is going to be, the grain you put on market is going to be sold at a price that's comparable with the domestically produced cereal. And that's not the case, because cereal prices, the imported cereal prices are going to be higher than domestically produced cereal. That's one thing. The other is actually the ability to do that, because you don't have enough foreign exchange, so you're not going to import as much cereal to meet the demand, so there's going to be a shortage of cereal, even if you're trying to offset the decline in production. So I think your thinking is correct, and that's why we're talking about how to ensure that the government can replenish that grain storage so that they can anticipate the drops in production. Because if they're drawing from their grain reserves, they have a little bit of control of the prices so that they can replenish, feed the market without raising the price. But when you rely on the foreign prices, first of all, you may be facing higher prices. So, for example, in 2008, that's when one of the year where you have a huge inflation is when they had both high prices internationally and that dropped. And that really spiked because the prices just spiked. So, exposure to international prices, you don't know how the prices will be, but also it may take time to import the cereal, and in the meantime, people are going to be suffering higher prices. But I think you're right. It's about how do you constitute a reliable source of supply of grain so it can make up for the shortage of things. The vis-a-vis the oil subsidy, I have to admit I didn't quite understand the reasoning. You were saying that because of what I had said before and drawing on what Bob had mentioned, is that if you look at the non-food price index, one of the reasons why it is so smooth is that, in fact, the government does anticipate increase in oil prices and subsidizes the oil price, so that on the market you don't see that jump in the oil prices, even though international prices are going up. You may see it later, but you don't see it here. Of course, the challenge with subsidies is, of course, how do you finance? If you have budget surpluses, or you can increase taxes without undermining the economy, then you can in fact achieve the objective of stabilizing the inflation without blowing your budget deficit. Because if you deficit finance it, then it may have inflationary effects through other channels. I don't know if I understood you.
Yeah, so that's what your thing says, that the fiscal factor drives food price inflation as well.
Yeah. So again, I think the concern is, I mean, the idea is, for the government, the idea is that they don't like to have the economy face the full brunt of oil shocks. So they try to absorb that. But what we're discussing now is the challenge of how we actually do that. And they have been, for ages, the donors have been on their back. They say, this is too expensive, you cannot sustain it, this is what driving the deficit. But the public is very happy when they can afford the gasoline. It's not just gasoline for people who drive cars, it's also people use it for lighting in transport, also lighting in the house. But it's a very interesting question.
I'm working on phasing out some of these subsidies. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, because even today I sent a message to my colleagues